We are concealed of our own identity. And it's impossible to predict where we're going without knowing where we're from.
What would it take for a nation to be great? I think it takes problem recognition. More structurally, what would it take for problem recognition? I think open-mindedness.
In the absence of full understanding of our history, and the absence of competence, accountability, and integrity in political discussions, what are we left with? Now, the big topic for today's session is 7th century cycle, regaining our glory. Regaining our glory. Well, that entails some understanding that we were once glorious. Otherwise, what would be, regaining means, right? So, and the second implicit consequences from that framing is that now it's the time to regain the glory. So I would like to invite Pak Gita Wirjawan in the next 30 minutes or so to explain, please come in, to explain a little bit about Indonesia's state of the art and then what we should do in order to regain the glory. And then after that, we will have some dialogue, not only between us, but with you as well, to talk about more either philosophical or pragmatic issues around geopolitics, about international trade, about the philosophy, about Indonesian raison d'être, and why would Indonesia be important in the world? Why should it exist at all? We want to tackle some of this topic. And I must say, before I give it to Pak Gita Wirjawan, one of the exciting things, I think, discussing with you is that all of this is unscripted. It has always been the case. And I think, judging from my experience as a lecturer here at Nottingham, it is that particular unscripted presentation of knowledge that is more engaging to the students. Because you come here not knowing exactly what you're going to bring home. I don't know what I'm going to bring home. So we are here engaging in the process of knowledge creation. And that's the seductive bit about this discussion, or how I would imagine it to be. Okay, so that's long enough introduction. And please, Pak Gita Wirjawan, for the next 30 minutes, let's give another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Bagus. This is my second visit to Nottingham, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Bagus. And of course, he's always taken me out to the nicest restaurants in Nottingham. So that's a big plus. Bagus, I think, is one of the few representatives of Indonesia at Nottingham, but also at the same time, one of the few representatives of Nottingham in Indonesia. Imagine if we had 100 million people in Indonesia that could actually speak English and represent the interest of the country to the rest of the world. You'd be living in a completely different era of Indonesia. And the reality is right now, less than 10% of the population of Indonesia would speak English, would have a good command of any international language. We live on this planet having evolved in the last 4.5 billion years into where we are. And just to give you a bit of a picture of where we're going to turn out in the next probably 7 to 10 years, by 2030 or by 2033, there's going to be more obese people than poor people. There's going to be more handphones than toilets. There's going to be a much bigger middle class in the middle powers and what used to be a developing country called China, what used to be a developing country called India, what used to be called a developing country, Indonesia, than anywhere else around the world. And the former developing countries of India, China, and most parts of Southeast Asia, and most parts of Africa would be some of the most robust economic hotspots around the country compared to what we might have been seeing in Europe and or the United States. That's the upside. The downside is, anybody know how many people are going to be living in the urban cities? How many percent of the population? As of today, and as of 10 years from today? It's about 50 to 60%. So as of today, out of the 8 billion people, about 4 billion people live in urban areas. The rest are living in suburban or rural areas. Anybody know what the kilometerage or the square mileage of those living on a planet? It's about 195 million square miles. Okay? Indonesia is about 2 million square kilometers. And only 1% of the habitable places around the planet is occupied by those that are claiming themselves to be urbanites. So just think about it. 4 billion people out of the 8 billion people, these 4 billion people are the urbanites. They're actually living on less than 2 square million miles of area, which is only 1% of the 195 to 200 million square miles of area that are habitable. All this is going to create massive changes from where we are today, much less from where we were 50, 100, 200 years ago. Now, this morning I gave a lecture on geopolitics and the effects of geopolitics, or the effects onto geopolitics, by way of the 3 paradoxes of AI, sustainability, and internet. I'm going to dwell into this a little bit deeply, but let me talk to you a little bit about the history of our region, Southeast Asia, before I peel off the onion so that I can talk more about Indonesia. In the last 2,000 years, we've had a massive peace and stability. How do I know that? If I count the number of lives lost by way of differences of opinions or views with regards to ethnicity, race, or religion, in Southeast Asia, they do not amount to any more than 9 million lives. And I'll repeat, 3 millions out of the 9 millions took place in the Vietnam War. So you compare that with 190 million lives that would have been lost in Europe, you can rest assured that Southeast Asia has been a region of tremendous peace and stability. And this was manifested in how we in Southeast Asia beautifully embraced the visitation of the Buddhists from India. And they basically graced the whole region for about 400 years. We embraced it. Many of us became Buddhist. We even created a kingdom in 650. We called it Sriwijaya. And throughout that kingdom's era, the scholars from China, they would actually grace our schools in Palembang, or many parts of South Sumatra, before they would traverse over to Nalanda, the famous Buddhist university in India. That went on for about 400 years. The culmination of which was basically when the Shailendra dynasty started building this cool thing called the Borobudur Temple in 750. It took them 75 years. They completed the monumental task in 75 years They erected this beautiful Buddhist temple, completed it by the year 825, and all of a sudden it vanished. The Shailendra dynasty vanished mysteriously. I mean, one would argue that it wasn't as mysterious as I claim, but what I'm trying to make a point of is that the technological innovation, the civilizational presence were as disruptive as they disappeared. Then in the latter part of the 13th century came this cool guy by the name of Raden Wijaya, who was a Hindu, who basically decided not to prolong or continue the pre-existence of Singhasari, and went on to build what was then called the Majapahit kingdom. It went on until the early parts of the 16th century. And they were able to differentiate themselves from the Sriwijayas. Anybody want to take a guess what the difference or the differentiation would have been between the Sriwijaya and the Majapahit eras? Industrialization, right? Industrialization took on a much bigger part during the Majapahit era. Yes, you could argue that the Shailendras built, the biggest Buddhist temple in the world until today, but they were not able to pervasively industrialize across Indonesia. I would argue that it's for lack of two goods/services. Lack of raw materials and lack of labor. Whereas the Majapahit kingdom, being in Java, it was a beneficiary of much higher access to raw materials, call it wood, and much higher access to labor, which is called people. And they were able to create one of the biggest maritime industries in the whole of Southeast Asia, thereby garnering a large territorial integrity from the western parts of Indonesia to the eastern parts of Indonesia, even encroaching over into some other areas in Southeast Asia. But then in the 16th century, things kind of fell apart in Demak. Demak was the place where Islam was emerging in a big way. Then came the Islamic infiltration. Then shortly thereafter, colonization. Then shortly thereafter, a long, miserable period of pain, of demeaning, of belittling, of humiliation for a little over 300 years, until we got ourselves kind of together in the last century and we decided to become independent with the support of the United Nations. And we went through a number of experiments, part of which would have been what we call the guided democracy, which basically lasted between 1955 until 1965. President Sukarno basically experimented with the idea of guided democracy, but he wasn't successful in democratizing what needed to be democratized. What needed to be democratized was basically the security apparatus. If you take a look at the history of Indonesia since independence, it's really been about creating a balance between three elements. The first is the security apparatus, the second is civil society, and the third is Islam. Those are the three main elements of the fabric of Indonesia there since. It failed miserably in 1965. He paid a dear price, and we know what happened in 1965. Then came the Asian financial crisis in 1998. We paid a dear price. Then we were basically told to embrace what is called now democracy. There since, we've basically been defying and denying every pontification by pundits that we were going to balkanize, shortly after 1998. We've stayed together And I would make the point and the argument that the reason why we've been able to stay together peacefully and stably, it's all highly correlated to the point I made earlier. The DNA of Southeast Asia is that we are very good in embracing the culture of pragmatism. The culture of pragmatism is the culture of basically not rubbing shoulders in a bad way with your neighbors. We have to be peaceful with our neighbors at any cost. But we suck at embracing the culture of principles, right? The culture of principles is manifested beautifully in Singapore. Singapore has been a clear exception in Southeast Asia in terms of embracing both the culture of pragmatism, staying peaceful and stable, and also embracing the culture of principles. The culture of principles is basically manifested in any country's ability to distribute public goods. I've been making the argument that Singapore ought to be regarded as a relatively successful democracy. Better yet, a relatively successful liberal democracy, because it cannot just be measured by way of its sheer distribution of power to the hands of many. It has to be measured by way of its distribution of public goods to the hands of many. Public goods being defined by healthcare, welfare, intellect, moral value, social value. Who in this room, when landing in Singapore, would throw garbage recklessly? Nobody. Who in this room has experienced a public service that is so bad that reminds you of Indonesia? That reminds you of India? That reminds you of Tanzania? That reminds you of Ecuador? Nobody. So I think there needs to be a revisit with respect to the definition of democracy. Democracy, I think, needs to be looked at in a country's ability to distribute public goods, not just the distribution of power. So we've had many experiments in the last 2,000 years until 1998, and we've survived as a pretty good democracy in terms of only the distribution of power to the hands of many. We still have a lot of homework in terms of our need to distribute public goods to the hands of many. Until such time when our public goods, such as welfare, healthcare, intellect, moral value, social value, are at the kinds of levels that we're seeing in Singapore, we need to take a look, or a good look at ourselves, right? So if I were asked as to what would it take for a nation to be great, I think it takes problem recognition. More structurally, what would it take for problem recognition? I think open-mindedness. Let me bring up a couple of examples where I've seen open-mindedness as being highly correlated to a great nation building. Anybody here know what the Abbasid Empire is? The Abbasid Empire was basically created about 90 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. It started out in the 8th century, lasted until the 13th century. For about 5 centuries, it was spearheaded by the likes of Mansur, Harun al-Rashid, and it basically culminated in a massive renaissance in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, where they invited atheists, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Zoroastrians, Hindus, Buddhists, from all over the world to congregate in what was then called the Bait al-Hikmah, which is equivalent of the House of Wisdom. They congregated to basically philosophize on matters of importance to humanity. And the way they emulated the philosophization of anything was no different from anything Aristotelian, right? So they were open-minded in terms of inviting people from all directions of geography, all directions of ethnicity, race, and religion, but they also were able to refer back to what they thought was cool And they thought that the Greek philosophy was a cool thing to emulate. Open-mindedness resulted in 5 centuries of Renaissance, a lot of which was copycatted by the Europeans. A lot of it was copycatted by the Indians. A lot of it was copycatted by the Chinese. But then they lost it all in 1253, when they all got invaded by Ulagu Khan, a Mongol emperor who basically just didn't like the idea that these people were not willing to be subordinated to the Mongols. They burned the libraries, they burned the people, they killed about 1 million people in Baghdad. They lost it all. If it wasn't for that episodic stress, I think the influence of the Abbasid Empire in terms of its open-mindedness would have lasted a lot longer and a lot wider geographically. The next example of open-mindedness is really the Singaporean mentality. Any Singaporean in this room? Okay, because people have been labeling me as the ambassador of Singapore. I hold no qualms about this. I think you need to realize how good Singapore has been. You can't hide behind the curtain that Singapore is better than us in many respects. Singapore, through the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, basically was able to identify where they were deficient, and more importantly, where they could actually remedy their deficiencies from. They were never interested in reinventing the wheel. They were always interested in copycatting any pre-existing remedy for whatever disease or symptoms that they were suffering from. You know, the famous saying is, if you've got a broken toilet, figure out how to fix the toilet by way of going around the world and figuring out which country knows how to fix the toilet best. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. That's the kind of open-mindedness and the kind of pragmatism that Singapore was able to thrive in the last few decades. And I always talk about money. Everything that matters, or most things that matter, actually relate back to your ability to attract capital. Capital formation has been very, very robust in Singapore. I've given a separate lecture here some months ago about how Singapore has been very successful in attracting FDI. FDI is in foreign direct investment. Their ability to attract FDI on a per capita per year basis is $19,000. Just so that you know, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam, we've only been able to attract FDI at a rate of about $100 to $400 per capita per year. Let me repeat, $100 to $400 as compared to $19,000 by the Singaporeans. And if any of you would be tempted to argue that that's relative because the population of Singapore is small, I'll give you the absolute. In 2021, Singapore was able to garner $105 billion of FDI. The second biggest recipient of FDI in 2021 was Indonesia, at only $30 billion. So on an absolute and relative basis, Singapore wins out. And that's not a function of ideology, geography, nor anything else. It's just a function of the enforceability of rules and regulations. So what would it take to go forward for a country or a nation like Indonesia? And I'll try to be politically correct here, because there's political sensitivity given the fact that there's going to be a political process in the next few months. I think what it takes is open-mindedness. And what it takes is knowing where your shortfalls are. We fall short of basically identifying where we suck. We always focus on where we're good at. It's important, but I think it's more important to focus on where we're bad at. Number three, we take the long view on fixing things. Where do you fix things in the long view? I think education is key. I've always been vocal about education, both at the tertiary and the non-tertiary level. Yesterday, we had an announcement by the Ministry of Education in terms of where PISA, our PISA rankings have gone up by 5 or 6 points, right? Okay, just so you know, it's gone up from number 71 to number 65, okay? It's not like from number 71 to number 18, okay? We still have a long way to go. We've improved, but we've got a long way to go. How do we fix that? I don't think it's about the curriculum. I don't think it's about money. It's about the teachers. I think if you want to fix the nation from a non-tertiary standpoint, you figure out a way so that our kids will have access to the greatest teachers. Bagus is one of them. I hope all of you are the next teachers for the nation, right? There is this empirical evidence where if you pick teachers from the top 20th percentile, they're going to be able to teach in a year about a year and a half's worth of teaching. But if you pick from the bottom 20%, they're only going to be able to teach about 6 months worth of teaching in about a year. So imagine most of the kids that are exposed to basically teachers that are coming from the bottom 20%. Having gone to school for about 14 years, they only have about 7 years of teaching in their brains. How can you expect them to go to Nottingham? How do you expect them to go to all the great universities around the world? And that's an unfortunate reality for most kids in Indonesia. I don't think it's an unfixable situation. It's an easily fixable situation, especially with the assistance of AI and many educational processes around the world right now. I'm actually a big believer that AI is going to be able to boost learning process by orders of magnitude from now onward. Second, at the non-tertiary level, is really the lingual proficiency. If you asked me 2 to 3 years ago as to how long it's going to take for 100 million people in Indonesia to be able to speak English, probably 20 to 30 years. But if you ask me now, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm actually involved on the board of a couple of AI companies that are focused on basically teaching people how to speak English. It's amazing what kind of improvements we've been able to make. And I'm very confident that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be able to get 100 million people in Indonesia to be able to speak English. And I'm also confident that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be able to see 3 to 400 people, 3 to 400 million people in Southeast Asia to be able to speak English. Just imagine if 100 million people from Indonesia can speak English, 400 million people in Southeast Asia can speak English. We're going to be able to take the lunch back from the Indians. We're going to be able to take the lunch back from the Singaporeans. We're going to be able to take the lunch back from the Filipinos. Why do I focus on English? Because most of knowledge has been documented in English. Because most of economic activities are done in English. Imagine a scenario where an Afghan is trading with an Ethiopian. Are they going to use Mandarin as a language? They're going to speak in English. Imagine a Chinese trading with an Ecuadorian. It's not going to be in Spanish nor Mandarin. It's going to be in English. So it's not out of love for English. It's just sheer pragmatism. And it goes back to my Singaporean example. Singapore has become what it is because of its ability to embrace the culture of pragmatism, but also at the same time, the culture of principles. So I've talked about the non-tertiary level. The last bit is the tertiary level of education. This is where we suck, relatively speaking. I've gone through this in one of the episodes of my podcast with Professor Haryadi Gunawi. We take a look at the numbers in 2020 or 2021 in terms of the PhD graduates in the US in STEM. There are about 6,000 something Chinese that got a PhD in STEM in the US. 2,000 something from India, 1,000 something from South Korea, 400 something from Turkey. You know what the number is from Indonesia? Anybody want to take a crack? Oh, you saw the podcast. Is that called cheating or learning? It's 82. The number from Ghana was 113. Ghana. Anybody from Ghana here? Last time I checked, it's not a member of the G20. But they were able to produce more PhDs in STEM than we did. That kind of hurts, doesn't it? So I've talked a lot about this in terms of our representation in the UK. There is about 4,000 Indonesians, give and take. There's about 200,000 Chinese in the UK at all universities. There's about 8,500 Indonesians all across universities in the US, about 400,000 Chinese in the US. In my time in the 80s, we used to have 16,000 Indonesians. The number has dwindled from 16,000 to 8,500. And our representation at the PhD level in STEM is nowhere near where it could be, where it should be, where it must be. I mean, it's got to be in the 2,000 to 3,000 per year, up there with the Indians at least. Or at least between the South Koreans and the Indians, between 1,000 something or 2,000 something, right? And there is always this myth about lack of funding, and Professor Haryadi has basically unequivocally underlined that it's not about funding. It's the myth of lack of competence. It's not the myth of lack of funding. Because as soon as you get accepted into a PhD program in the US for a STEM program, 80% of them have been funded by the very institutions that have accepted them. So you just got to make sure that you get accepted at MIT, at Caltech, at Princeton, at Imperial, at Nottingham. The money will come. And there's a fix to this. There's a remedy to this. And I've suggested this to the Minister of Education. I've suggested this to, which I think they're working on. It's through this bimbingan belajar, right? There's no reason for you not to basically line up about 1 million people a year to focus on learning how to speak English and score well on TOEFL. Lining up about 500,000 of them to basically make sure that they do well on SAT, on GMAT, on GRE, on MCAT, on LSAT, and all that, those things that need to be administered and taken. We've got the money. We've got a lot more money now than we ever did in the 90s and the 80s, much less 70s and 60s. Just needs focus, right? And I think with the long view taking and incrementally fixing the bits and pieces at the non-tertiary level and at the tertiary level, then you can start hoping and expecting something great lurking about your nation and country. Third is really finding talent. I've always been making this point about the sub-optimum between talent and power, right? We've seen in many democracies around the world where talent selection has been a lot more based on loyalty and or patronage as opposed to meritocracy. Why is that? If I were to speculate, I think a lot of that is social media. If I were to even speculate further, it's because most of you are spending about 10 hours a day on your mobile phones. And most of that is TikTok or Instagram, right? At the rate that you're looking at things that I just can't, I'm getting hooked to Instagram nowadays because I love dogs. I like to see dogs on Instagram. It's correlated with the need to festivalize and sensationalize as opposed to intellectualize, right? Your inability to intellectualize or your inability to choose somebody based on intellectualization is somewhat correlated with the inability to find the right optimal point between talent and power. And a suboptimum in terms of finding a point between talent and power is a discount. Is a discount to your ability to infuse governance with good people, infuse leadership with good people. And we're seeing this pervasively happening in many democracies around the world. Paradoxically, in China, which is an autocracy, they've been able to democratize talent a heck of a lot better than we in Indonesia, India, and the United States as democracies. So paradoxically, an autocracy has been able to democratize talent a lot better than democracies being able to democratize talent. So the answer or the medicine or the fix to whatever you might be seeing as problematic is right there. It just depends on whether or not you want to do what you have to do. Fix the non-tertiary, fix the tertiary, and then fix the polarization of conversations, and then focus on intellectualization of conversations. Last, I want to talk about a little bit of what I talked about this morning. There are three paradoxes. The first paradox is the paradox of the internet. The internet was introduced a few decades ago, and it was supposed to be the fixer, the equalizer, the leveler. But it didn't. It democratized information, but it didn't democratize ideas. And to the extent that it democratized ideas, it didn't help with respect to getting the ideas access to capital. As a result of which, it became the elitizer. Those that had early access to internet became the billionaires. Those that had the later access to the internet became the small people. Those that had access to information but didn't have access to ideas, or those that had access to ideas but didn't have access to capital, became the marginalized. Empirically, this is manifested in the Gini coefficient ratio, which is pretty universal. The Gini coefficient ratios have gone up in developing economies and also developed economies. Take a look at the Gini coefficient ratio of China and that of the United States. It's in the high 40s. Indonesia is in the mid or low 30s. The second paradox is the paradox of sustainability. It's about the irreconcilable nature between the narrative of sustainability and the narrative of development. The narrative of sustainability tells us that we've got to do whatever we've got to do to attain carbon neutrality by 2050. But we can't do that because most of the population of the planet are still concerned about putting food on the table, irrespective of what the source of energy would have been. If you tell me to stop using coal today, I don't mind, as long as the alternatives are affordable. But there is no alternatives that are affordable. The difference is basically procuring renewable energy at a cost of 15 to 20 cents on a kilowatt basis, as compared to coal, which is procured at a cost of about 5 cents. So anybody that's smart out there that wants to tell me to use a renewable energy, he or she needs to be able to put that energy source on the table at a cost of 5 cents, without which I'm not going to be able to switch, right? Anybody know how much power generation capability has been built for the planet? Anybody want to take a guess? It's about 8 terawatt. The target for modernity to be attained for the whole of the planet is to move that needle from about 8 terawatt to about 15 or 16 terawatt. So let's do the math here. If we want to build the extra 7 or 8 terawatt at a cost of about 2.5 million per megawatt, that's about 35 trillion. Sorry, 8 terawatt times $2.5 million per megawatt. That's about up to $20 trillion. You with me? Okay? And most of the pre-existing 8 terawatt is coal, is carbon emitting. So if we want to be good citizens of the world, we've got to basically substitute or replace these, right, with renewables. So we've got to build an additional, I would guess, about 6 terawatt, because that's a component that's carbon emitting. So all in all, if we want to be good citizens of the world and live on a planet beautifully ever after, with 16 terawatts worth of power generation capabilities on a renewable basis, economically, we're going to need about 30 to 40 trillion dollars. Okay, how many zeros are those? And it's not renminbi, it's not rupiah, it's not ringgit, it's not rupee, it's dollars. Who has that kind of money? So we come from developing country. We represent the hearts and minds and the thinking of most of the global South, right? We have a structural limitation. We don't have that kind of money. We do not have access to 30 to 40 trillion dollars worth of liquidity. Who has that liquidity? It's the G7 countries. If you take a look at the liquidity that's floating around the world, it's mostly in G7 countries. It amounts to at least $100 trillion worth of liquidity. It's just there, circling around. It's not moving to our direction, nor other directions. So you've got to figure out a way to be able to communicate with these guys that are in control of the liquidity. Without which, you're not going to be able to fix this thing. Or just keep using coal, right? There needs to be not only a communicator, but an interlocutor. Somebody that can mediate between the interest of the global South and that of the developed economies. How do you do that? Speak English, right? So there is actually a path towards a resolution, if not a solution, right? And it's not going to be instantaneous. This will require long view taking. So, in conclusion, how does it bode for the future of Indonesia? I think you're going to have to be ready for some sort of a muddle-through narrative, right? It's not going to be an immediate spike, right? You got to be patient because you're still just in the 20s. I'm pushing 60, man. I'm a lot older than you, right? And I speak from some experience. But I think if you take the long view, it's going to be pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome in the sense that you're going to be blessed with the third largest democracy in the world, the fourth most populous, but a fantastic demographic base that can be turned into an engine that's going to be so robust. That engine is going to be sputtering in the next few years, but I believe in luck, and I believe in serendipity. But you know what drives luck or serendipity? Anybody here play golf? You play golf. There is a saying by a famous golfer called Gary Player. The more he practices, the luckier he gets. So you just got to keep on practicing. Look at yourself in the mirror, keep practicing. Do what you're good at. At some point, you're going to get lucky. When you get lucky, the nation turns around. And I want to end at the very end here with remarks on Singapore again. I hate to go back to Singapore. But I think Singapore managed to get a quality leadership by way of serendipity. It wasn't institutional to begin with. You know, it started out with a guy by the name of Lee Kuan Yew, who studied at Oxford, transferred over to Cambridge, could have been the best lawyer in London, New York, Tokyo, Beijing, Singapore, Hong Kong, anywhere around the world, the highest paid. But the guy chose to go back to Singapore and work for free and help the labor union for free. And he started out on a mission with 3 words: competence, integrity, and accountability. If you read the Bible of the PAP, which is about 800 pages long, every chapter, it only mentions 3 words, essentially: competence, integrity, and accountability. And imagine if Singapore would have gotten a different guy by the name of Robert Mugabe. Singapore would have turned out very differently. So think about Indonesia as a nation that could be beneficiary of some serendipitous moment. But that serendipity is not going to take place without practice. And that practice is not going to take place without you're taking a view on those things that I've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, thank you very much indeed for that clear and concise presentations encapsulating Indonesia's state of the art, starting from the second half of the first millennium. Now, there's a lot of things that I want to talk to you about, starting from international trade, geopolitics, diplomacy, necessity of English education, until the current internal politics as well. So let me start by the first half of your presentation, in which you gave a clear summary about the kinds of kingdom that Indonesia has experienced, which probably contributed to Indonesia's and South Asia's capability of accepting multitude of points of view, because we've experienced multitudes of points of view. Now, okay, so if you take a look at countries that have clear narratives in the way they do international trades or in a way they project themselves in the global stage, much of this stem from their very bold identity. German, for example, their policy which then led to the World War II pretty much hinged on their identity, the concept of Lebensraum. The Chinese also have that to some degree. I studied in China, in Taiwan or China, depends on where you look at it. Well, the way they see themselves is the center of the world, right? That's what China in Chinese is, 中国, right? The center of the world. And you can see how their One Belt, One Silk Road policy stem from there. Now, I try to bring it to Indonesian context. Now, if you mentioned a little bit about Sriwijaya in the 700s. Sriwijaya is very trading reliant economy, apart from being maritime superpower, I guess. And they were very friendly to neighboring countries. They do trades all the time. That's one of the reasons why they are in longer period of prosperity compared to Majapahit, although Majapahit has a lot bigger area that they conquered. They trade nutmeg. Nutmeg at the time is weighs in gold because, you know, anything that can make food taste good and can preserve meat is really expensive. So Indonesia, naturally, if you take a look at that era, is very trade friendly. Okay, now, you were a former trade minister, right? So you know that Indonesia is part of a multitude of trade agreements, and the regional comprehensive economic partnership, the conception of which was well within the purview of yours while you were trade minister in 2011.
Yes,
2011,
11.
right?
Yeah.
So we are, at least on paper, based on our inclusion in the agreements, are friendly, internationally trade speaking. But we also hear rhetorics about protectionist economy. You know, don't export nickel, don't export palm oil, stop doing this, stop doing that, you know, put tariffs and several stuff. So what are we actually? Well, you're probably in the best position to explain about that. If you can take some inspiration from the past and looking into the future, how do we position ourselves in terms of international trade and whether or not exchange rate should be made friendly, but then there are countries who manipulate their own money supply. How do we deal with this very different world compared to the year 700s?
Yep. 2011 was a difficult year. There was a lot of politics domestically. There was a lot of populism. With the benefit of hindsight, I think anybody that's interested in promoting trade, just to give you a sense, our ratio of trade to GDP is at about 35%. Okay? It's low, right? You'd want it to be at least 50%. Singapore's trade to GDP ratio is higher than 100%. Just imagine. They actually trade goods and services at an amount higher than their own GDP. Tough to handle. So, on one hand, I would make the argument that you don't want to open up the borders for the flows of goods and services that, number one, you're not going to be able to compete with. Number two, that you don't see any hope of being able to actually produce anything of competitiveness with those coming in, right? But on the other, you're interested in internationalizing the narrative of your country, right? And if you shut the door, you're at risk of not being able to internationalize your narrative. And it's important for the third largest democracy in the world, the fourth most populous country in the world, the largest economy in Southeast Asia, to be able to be internationalist, right? So, with the benefit of hindsight, I would take comfort in opening up the borders for any flows of goods and services from anywhere around the world, as long as they're not undermining our territorial integrity, right? Number two, as long as we have the conviction that we're going to be able to attract capital formation. We call that investments, right? Because at the end of the day, if you want to improve the competitive advantage domestically so that you can actually compete with the goods and services that are coming from overseas, you're going to need the capital to build, right? The manufacturing capabilities, the infrastructure needed for those manufacturing capabilities. But those are not going to happen without capital formation. However, there are many economies around the world who are basically in a quandary. A quandary in the sense that they're not in any position to be able to attract capital. And they're pressed in a corner with over-populism, that they're not going to be able to basically open the doors. I think to some extent, India could be that example, right? India suffers from massive populism, right? That's the very reason why they didn't sign up with RCEP.
Oh, they did?
The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We actually invited India. We invited Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and China. They all joined in, right? They finally signed. One country didn't sign up, India. And I just met with the current commerce or trade minister a couple of weeks ago at the APEC summit in San Francisco. I had a long chat with him. He even said that not only will I not join RCEP, with the benefit of hindsight, I would not even have signed up for the possibility of joining. You see that? That's a much more structural definition of where they stand with respect to the flows of goods and services from outside. And India has not been a great FDI attractor, right? I think they're going to be much better in the future because they're now articulating the stories a lot better than the last 20 years. So I would advise anybody who's going to be in charge of trade, certainly not me, that if he or she wants to promote the opening of the doors for the flows of goods and services from anywhere around the world, he or she needs to be of the conviction that there is a wherewithal within the country to actually attract capital. In the absence of which, I think you're in a lose-lose scenario. Yeah?
Yeah. So no. Well, when it comes to the boldness of India, I think you mentioned quite in a session this morning that India is a very good storyteller, right? And I'm captivated by this idea. One of the President Jokowi's most favorite poet is Gibran, but Khalil Gibran.
Wow, this could get really interesting.
And he mentioned that humans' basic necessity after eating and drinking is to tell a story.
Yeah.
Tell a story, and they're really good at it. Well, there are a couple of things that telling story entails. Telling story entails knowing the beginning and end, and knowing your archetype, knowing who yourself. Otherwise, how could you tell story, much less from a first-person point of view, right? It's very difficult to know about ourselves. When the Chinese were asked about what a perfect person from China, they could say it. You could argue that if the Western world, without specifying any country, were asked what would make a perfect American, some would argue that's Christ. Maybe, I don't know. It's very difficult to ask the same question about Indonesia, and I got several half-baked theory about it. It's probably because we are somewhat concealed about our own history. Now, the Shailendra dynasty and the Mataram kingdom, they have Borobudur and Prambanan. Yeah. Majapahit, on the other hand, is very dominating. I think it's the country that really unify most of the archipelago, if not more. But it lasts only for about 100 or so years. And if you take a look at the remnants of their architectures, there's not much left. But if you go to the British Museum, you can find the Wardenar map of Trowulan.
Yep.
You can find that, for example.
Go to Holland, you find more.
Yes, exactly. Now, the British has something to do with that too.
Yeah.
At that time when the Interregnum museumized Java to some degree. So it's very difficult to find our identity. And there was the period a couple of weeks ago where I was interested in a stone inscription from the era of Mataram, the Sangguran inscription and the Puchangan inscription. One of them is in Scotland at this point right now. The problem is that it belongs to private property, so there's nothing the governments can do because governments cannot access private property. But you see, there it entails story about Merapi explosion, for example, which tells a very rich story if you are a geologist, particularly anthropocenic geologist, because anthropocenic geologists study about the epoch when humankind started to influence the geological process, which a lot of international scholars learn a lot from Indonesia, from Java, from Yogyakarta. These are places where you could argue earth science actually come from in its modern conception. But we are concealed of our own identity.
Yeah.
Because of that, we don't know or we know so little about Majapahit compared to what we're supposed to know. So we're like a cosmic orphan. It's like we don't know where we're from, and it's impossible to predict where we're going without knowing where we're from. So there are some countries probably that you mentioned about Singapore. You could also ask, well, where does Singapore come from? Well, it comes from a bunch of different places. What unified them? You mentioned about competence, integrity, and accountability. And very strong punitive policy too, I guess. Try to throw a bubble gum on the street, right? So you could make that in the absence of a grassroots identity. You can make a very strong policy that encourages that. But we hardly see competence being included in political discussions at all. I don't see that being championed as the marker of a good leader, at least not on a popular level. You don't see that the next Indonesian leader has got to be like the most bloody competent one. So what's your... So in the absence of full understanding of our history, and the absence of competence, actual accountability and integrity in political discussions, what are we left with?
I try to be implicit about this earlier. It's likely to be a muddle through narrative, right, in a near foreseeable future. Muddle through it's like this, but just make sure that the directionality is upward, right? And I do believe very, very strongly that in the near future, there is going to be an inflection point, right? And I got to be very careful there. I think the muddle through nature is shaped by the pre-existing oligarchical forces, right? Which are in control of the pre-existing system that has limitations, that may not be able to entail the selection of talent a lot more based on meritocracy. But you just swallow that. You swallow that and you invest in what needs to be invested and think that things are going to get better in the future, either by way of systemic approaches or by way of serendipity, right? Just keep at it. We're going to get luckier. We're not lucky today. We're not lucky in the sense that we're blessed with, somebody or people that may be characterized by the kinds of attributes that you're referring to, right? But I do believe that, if you take the long view, I think things will be very robust. So the challenge is scale, right? How do we make sure that there's 200,000 Indonesians in the UK? How do we make sure that there's 200,000 Indonesians in China studying at all the universities there? 200,000 in Japan, 200,000 in Singapore, 200,000 in Australia, 200,000 in the US. When we get to that point, you've practiced. And then as you've practiced, you're going to get serendipitous. When you're going to get serendipitous, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that the meeting point between talent and power will be a lot more optimal.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I like that. The thing
I just want to make the clarification. Majapahit was actually a lot more maritime than Sriwijaya.
Yes.
They were able to build more ships than Sriwijaya because of those two things: access to labor in Java and access to raw materials, the wood.
Yeah, they're very industrialized too. They use gunpowder too at the time.
Yep.
Right. What I'm worried about is, Gita, that I see, look, I'm looking at Indonesia from outside Indonesia. So my view of Indonesia is probably skewed. Probably the reflection of Indonesian counterpart of mine through what I see from comments in YouTube and TikToks are not clear representative of what Indonesia truly is. Like, take a look at, when people loosely throw the phrase anak muda or youth or young people. 60-70% of young people, according to Bureau Pusat Statistik, are blue-collar workers. They're not latte sipping, Nottingham going, students with LPDP scholarship. They are in dire need of good educations. They are suffering. These are the true, by statistics, representative of anak muda. What I worry about, although I might be wrong, and I hope I am, is that there is a growing movement, either orchestrated or natural, of infantilization. And that is to paint young people as being not serious, shallow, unsophisticated, cannot even put on a three-piece suit. This is just two-piece suit. That's not what I want to see. I don't think the primordial soup from which competence emerge. There's no incentive for competence if what you see in social media is.
I think the anecdote to your concern is Endgame.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? We started Endgame 3 years ago as an idea experiment. And I'll say this again and again. We didn't think we were going to be able to get any more than 5,000 views. Honest to God. And as of today, cumulatively, we've got more than 70 million views. Right? We've gotten more than 710,000 subs. And if I take a look at the commentary, it is a reflection of the thirst and the hunger with respect to wisdom and knowledge that would have been pre-existing, that did not get fulfilled, right? And to me, that is an antidote to some of the concerns that you've raised, right? So I sit here with optimism, not pessimism. And I would like to share and radiate this optimism to you, that as much as you think that things are not going to get fixed anytime soon or instantaneously, things will get fixed. But focus on the obvious. The obvious is make sure that we move to the top 10 of PISA. We get 200,000 Indonesians in the UK. I'm putting pressure on Pak Desra here.
He is still in the audience.
We get 200,000 Indonesians in the US studying. We get 200,000 Indonesians in China, in Japan, in Australia, in Singapore. We don't do that, we're going to snooze and lose, right? And just start reading books. Stop looking at TikTok. Stop looking at Instagram, or look less, right? And then start reading books more. And, Bagus made a reference to how we're actually being blinded by our own, glories in the past. That's mainly because of our lack of ability to document. And that's not a uniquely Indonesian symptom. It's a uniquely Asian symptom. That's why the Chinese lost it for 100 years.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The century of humiliation was basically a product of their inability to document their own wisdom that would have been pre-existing for 5,000 years. But they figure out that they made a colossal mistake. And now they're documenting a lot better than the Western people, right? So you keep at it, you get serendipitous, right? Serendipity is not a divine concept. It's actually a practical concept. You can only get lucky if you practice. Without the practice of looking less at TikTok, you're not going to get serendipitous. So I would make the argument that if, how many books are there that have been cumulatively written and published? Want to take a guess? About 140 million books. How many adults are there in Indonesia? About 140 million. If we assign each adult in Indonesia to read one book, we would have captured the whole wisdom of the planet. And we put it all on YouTube in whatever language you want, in Sundanese, Javanese, Batak, Manadonese, Papuan, or whatever. How about that? You set up a startup that focuses on doing that.
Yeah.
It's not an easy, it's not a difficult task. It just requires somebody to wake up to the task and do it. So, if you go to a bookstore and look at the books that are written about Indonesia, most of the authors are white people. I have not seen a single book on Southeast Asia that would have been written by a Southeast Asian in a great way, meaning in terms of great numbers. There's been sporadic successes, right? Some of which are my good friends. But for the most part, it's the Europeans and the Americans that have been writing books about us. So start getting into the habit of documenting. You're not going to be able to document if you don't read books. And is that something that you're going to be able to acquire in your lifetime? Absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt. You just got to get to it. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now, Pak Gita, I would suggest that we take Q&A.
Sure.
And then we follow the discussion based on the follow-up of that question.
So you recently spoke to Ray Dalio and with Adino, both of whom I'm a great admirer of. I think in those podcasts, you have sort of concluded that we live in a very fractured world where the so-called liberal global international order is sort of coming to an end. In that regard, how do you think Indonesia sort of plays into that? And if another question, if I may, is sort of, you mentioned a lot about Singapore. A lot of my friends here in the UK ask what Singapore is like, and the easiest description that I always tell them is it's the closest manifestation to Plato's Republic. How do you think, in a sense, Indonesia can aim to replicate this kind of brewing of technocrats from young and go through this meritocratic system of reaching up to the highest cadre of leadership, essentially, in the way that Singapore does, and in the way that one could argue the CCP does as well. Maybe did better in the past, less so now. So yeah, that's.
Can I know your name?
Oh yeah, my name is Justin.
Are you Singaporean or Indonesian?
I'm Indonesian.
Okay, good. Okay. Why don't we take 3 questions and I'll answer?
Right, 3 questions first. Yeah.
Alright, so my name is Agnes and I'm Indonesian. Yeah, for Indonesia. I was really intrigued by your idea of cultural pragmatism versus the cultural principle. And I'm just really curious. You say that the recipe for a good country is to have a good balance between those two. So do you think that cultural principle is something that can be cultivated? And if it could, what kind of lever that Indonesia has to push to cultivate those? Thank you.
Sorry, name and where you're from?
Agnes from Imperial.
Imperial.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, Pak Gita. My name is Andres Tastia, PhD student from the University College London. Thank you for insightful discussion with Mas Bagus. Thank you also for Mas Bagus. And you both set the bar in a good place for us young people to feel challenged to overcome those bars. Thank you very much. So the construction of Borobudur Temple you mentioned, it takes around 75 years. It's like it takes like 8 presidential terms in Indonesia to build those
Longer.
Yeah,
Not 8 presidential terms.
It's like
You're talking about a dictatorship or a democracy here?
too much conservative.
Okay, two terms each. Okay, you're presumptuous here.
I talk about the nuclear power plant. It takes like 10 until 20 years from the initial front end until the construction and operations. It takes like more than one presidential terms. How, like if we take an example for the debates on the relocation of our capital city, it's kind of hard to imagine how we can build those nuclear power plant like a I want to ask how, besides reading book, what can I do to help it happen? Because it's like we have a prototype, but in the future, what we will have? That's the question that we should answer. Thank you very much.
All right. I've been very vocal about nuclear for the last couple of years. And if you would have read the announcement in Dubai yesterday, 20 countries have declared that they want to triple their nuclear power. I'm in a camp that believes in nuclear because nuclear is, I think, the clearest answer, on this paradox of sustainability. It's scalable, it's clean. It just takes money. And the myth of this not being safe, I think, needs to be displaced. Right? I would argue that that's probably, to some extent, the lobby of the fossil. And I would also make the argument that, from a valuation standpoint, nuclear companies, are not as aligned to the incentives as fossil companies have been in the last few decades. But nuclear requires long-term planning. You need about 10 years to plan. But you need to be thinking 100 years. And I discussed this quite explicitly with the Dean of the School of Sustainability at Stanford in one of my podcast episodes. I hope that more and more countries in Asia will think about this, and I'm hopeful that Indonesia will think about this. I think this could help, answer the problem with respect to sustainability. The only downside is cost, right? It's about 20 cents on a kilowatt basis. You got to learn how to bring it down to 5, if not 3 cents on a kilowatt basis. Until then, I think you've got to figure out, who's going to be financing that gap between 20 cents and 5 cents. It's not a perennial exposure because you built into the model your ability to basically move up the purchasing power from 5 cents to 10 cents to 15 cents. And then at the same time, technologically, you figure out a way to bring down the cost from 20 cents to 15 cents to 10 cents. So at some point in the next few years, there's actually going to be an optimal point between cost and revenue generation. The second question is with respect to what would it take for a nation to basically usher, the embracing of the culture of principles. I think it takes 2 steps. The first is really how to figure out creating a political culture at the minutest level. What I mean by that is, until such time when you have a political culture in your household, in your school, in your office, in your social institution, place of worship, at the bar, or at the pub, at the parties, about things that are relevant, I don't think you're going to be able to push forward the culture of principles. So you size up when you go to a party, when you go to a place of worship, when you go to your family reunion, when you go to your home, you go to office, you go to school. If your conversation all of a sudden turns in a direction where you start talking about sustainability, you start talking about inequality, you start talking about women empowerment, you start talking about things that are relevant to humanity going forward, as opposed to what would have been the latest gossip, then you can become hopeful when that light turns about where this nation is going. Until such time, you can be less hopeful. That's the first level. The second level is that moment of serendipity where you end up with somebody at the position of leadership who can actually be clear about where the future holds for everybody in the country. An absolutist with respect to what it takes to execute and doesn't bullshit about this, right? To the extent that you find that person in a position of leadership, he or she, who can be very clear about what it takes to embrace the future and what it takes to basically undertake the steps in an absolute and absolutist manner, then game on. We're not there yet, but I think we could be there. First question has two parts. International order has been pre-existing for a long time, and this was kind of shaped by the Washington Consensus at the end of the World War, and it lingered on beautifully until the early 2000s, which marked pretty much the end of what I call the unipolar era. The unipolar era basically started out in, call it 1990, a year after the Berlin Wall fell apart. And it basically allowed for one guy to tell everybody what to do. But then, as soon as China joined the WTO in 2001, and as soon as the US became distracted with the war on terror in 2001 onward, revisionism took place. And this revisionism was pushed forth by the middle power countries, manifested in BRICS and additional countries such as Nigeria, Turkey, Mexico, Indonesia. And this revisionism is going to carry on for a while, which basically has triggered the shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. I made the argument this morning in a class that multipolarity is something that we in the global South have gotten so used to embracing. But this is something that the United States is really struggling to embrace, right? So, in view of all these, I don't see the international order looking the same way it has in the past few decades, right? And in that Ray Dalio conversation, he basically iterated, what it takes to win money, right? Capital formation is key for any nation building. Like, number one, don't borrow too much. I don't speak with authority here because I borrow, and I'm trying to get rid of my borrowing. Number two, make sure you have no internal conflict. Number three, make sure that you don't have any external conflicts. So if you are delevered, better yet, unlevered, and you're basically bereft of internal conflicts and bereft of external conflicts, you're home free. You're going to fly, irrespective of whether or not the international order looks like the way it used to or looks like it's going to be, right? So the meeting point between power and talent, I think, is going to be determined by those two levels that I talked about. The quality of somebody in a position of leadership and the quality of the political culture that you push for and that you push forth at home, at the office, at school, at social institutions, place of worship, anywhere you go to. Until such time, we're all exposed.
Thank you. I'm so itching to respond to some of it, but I'm using my privilege as a moderator. So, No, I could talk on behalf of your first comment about nuclear energy. I think I second that. And Indonesia actually has a lot of potential sources. But potential doth butter no parsnips, we call it. Can't do anything but potential. Well, we are sitting on top of over 50% geothermal reserve, and because that's my own discipline, I can vouch for your opinion in saying that most of it is underutilized, and only 1% or even less that has been exploited. Even California has what, 8% of
8%.
geothermal or something like that?
They got a lot of nuclear, they got a lot of solar.
Yeah, but like nuclear, like geothermal, these are, first of all, it's front-end capital enterprise. It's expensive.
But they got money.
But they get money.
Yeah.
Second of all, it's very knowledge intensive too. It's very difficult to transfer heat, unlike taking oil. Heat has got to be transferred. This is not easy endeavor whatsoever. So, okay. Now, what I'm really interested in is your notion of political culture in a family. My family is very political. No, and so is my classroom. Look, I've never studied in the UK, and I came here diving headfirst into a lectureship. And some of my students are attending here. I am so surprised that they treat me like they're contemporaries, like equals. Yeah, sometimes it bugs me a little bit. You know how it looks like in Indonesia? We are at the pedestal. So, no, but anecdotally aside, that political culture manifests in the culture of debates.
Yeah. Well, the political culture doesn't necessarily have to be politics, right? The political culture has to be about what matters to humanity. Right. It needs to be discoursed. It needs to be debated. It needs to be discussed, right? It doesn't have to be about politics.
Right.
Right.
And I can sense that the Brits are very well versed when it comes to articulating their proposition, responding to counter arguments, and making it not as part of their idea of being polite. So one doesn't exclude the other. Being polite doesn't mean that I agree with you, which is a little bit intertwined in our culture, a little bit, for lack of a better term. You see, so I see that as a problem that has to be challenged, not in terms of top down, you don't make a regulation that prohibits this or that, but it has to come from within. And I think education is key for that.
Yeah, and it goes back to what I alluded to earlier. We've seen massive democratization of information not being accompanied by a commensurate amount of democratization of ideas, right? Somebody in a position of leadership needs to pave the way for a higher degree of democratization of ideas, right? And we actually have embraced this culturally. We call it musyawarah mufakat. Musyawarah mufakat in English simply means agree to disagree. You just learn how to agree to disagree. And that could be manifested in having gone through a debate over any issue that's relevant to, your life or humanity or whatever. But it's not practiced as much as it needs to be. So you just need to practice until you get serendipitous.
Yeah. Well done. So I'd like to invite another 3 questions. Can I invite one of them from my own students? So
just for some of you that don't know what serendipity means, hockey.
My question was wandering around the concepts of culture in Indonesia and how you compare it a lot to like Singapore and their culture and how they run things and their principles and how they their jurisdictions and stuff like that. I was wondering how you think it would be effective to like implement their rules to Indonesia, because I feel like there's a lot of culture behind, a lot of time and a lot of like cultivation behind Singapore's like rules and their laws and stuff like that, and how they act as a civilization and how effective that could be to implement that into Indonesia, knowing that there has to be a lot of time and effort put into like replicating such things. I just wanted to hear your views about.
Okay. Got it.
My name is Ryan. I came from Edinburgh, from here. I studied at the MSc of Sustainable Energy System, and I have a really strong engineering background and experience. So my question is specifically about your narrative about energy. You know that converting to renewable energy is really hard and really expensive. But not only that, we have to consider about the risk of failure of technology. Because after COP28, we already have a direction about technology what Indonesia choose. And as engineers, I concerned about the risk of failure of technology that need a major breakthrough. So my question is how you suggest me to deliver this to the stakeholders pragmatically, but not diminishing the value of the net zero emission on the 2016.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. My name is Al. I came from Edinburgh. I'm studying synthetic biology right now. I want to ask you about just a simple question: how to minimize intellectual bias in Indonesia? And then I want to ask about what a century ago, one of scientists in Manchester, the father of fermentation. His name is Ham Weizmann, if you know. He was a very famous because not only had British won World War I, but also the father of Israel. I mean, he created Israel and become the first president of Israel. How we create somebody that has ability to be a scientist, but also good on diplomacy and so on. I think one of the best and worst thing that happened in 20th century is the Balfour Declaration. It's created by Arthur Balfour, Edinburgh rectors, but also it's product of science diplomacy as well, because ethanol created by fermentation and so on and ethanol. I think we can mimic the approach of Jewish arts, Zionist movement in the good way, maybe to define something that we think it's right for us. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Good afternoon, pagi Pak, Mas Bagus. My name is Alan. I'm taking master degree at Department of Management and School of Economics in London. My question is, I would like to ask regarding one of my best friend here. Shout out to ChatGPT and stuff.
ChatGPT.
Or just me, or I think anyone here also, maybe. But what I would like to ask is regarding, do you agree that Indonesia is currently on the right track in terms of preparing our future generation to work side by side with AI and stuff? Because I gotta say, I'm very grateful that I think it's also a serendipitous that one of our best is now taking part as the Minister of Education, Mas Menteri Nadiem Makarim. So what I would like to ask is, do you think it's an opportunity for us to work side by side with AI sort of thing, or do you think it's basically a setback for Indonesia? Because I don't know, maybe we kind of get lazy though to read more books or journal because of this ChatGPT. Because I'm just gonna be honest that I use it a lot to summarize the things. So thank you, Gita and Mas Bagus.
Thank you.
Okay. You know, the first and second questions are somewhat related in a strange way, right? The question on culture and a question on financing, energy transition. What has helped Singapore attain its position of significance in many ways right? It's not perfect, but it's attained a position of significance in many dimensions, is its sheer ability to clearly enforce rules and regulations, right? When you go to Singapore, you know it is a trustworthy place. You put your money in Singapore because you deem it as being trustworthy. You deem it as being trustworthy because they clearly know how to enforce rules and regulations, right? The enforceability of rules and regulations is the most dominant factor in the actualization of so many attributes. No nation, historically speaking, has been able to achieve success in technology without rule of law. Achieve economic success without rule of law. Achieve cultural renaissance without rule of law. Achieve social renaissance without rule of law. Achieve moral renaissance without rule of law. Very clear, right? So if you want to start figuring out where Indonesia needs to go for in the future, then Indonesia needs to basically focus on what Singapore has been able to be good at. And that's in the context of the enforceability of rules and regulations. It's not about ideology, as I said earlier. It's not about geography, as I said earlier. It's not about whether or not we have natural resources, right? So that kind of leads up to the second question, where there is this disillusionment about risk-taking, right? Of course, there's always risk-taking. When you're digging the ground, somebody's got to take risks. Actually, a lot of people would like to take risks, but they just need to be given the assurance that after they take on the risks, the rules and regulations are well enforced, right? This is where we need to up the ante. This is where we need to get our act together a little bit better, right? And it goes back to the analysis or illustration I gave earlier about FDI. Indonesia has only been able to get an FDI at a rate of $100 per capita per year, as opposed to Singapore at $19,000. And again, let me emphasize, it's not because of ideology, it's not because of a geography, it's not because of natural resources. It's because of the perception of our lack of ability to enforce rules and regulations. If the perception and reality with respect to rules and regulations or rule of law improve to a higher level, if not much higher level, I'll bet you a donut. There's going to be a lot of people lining up to take on the risk for making sure that this energy transition towards renewability will be smoother. People will want to take on more risks because they know that there's clarity with respect to how they need to be adjudicated. If there is any hesitation, if there is any ambiguity with respect to the enforceability of rules and regulations. I'm in the camp that believes that we should be able to attract any amount of money for purposes of ushering this energy transition towards renewability if we fix that rule of law, right? Let's do the math here. What's the power generation capability of Indonesia? Anybody know? We're electrified at about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita, right? We have 75 gigawatts worth of power generation capabilities. or 75,000 megawatts. If we want to be a modern nation, we need to move the needle from 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to about 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. What it means is we've got to build an additional, they're about 350,000 megawatts. At a rate of $2 to $2.5 million per kilowatt, we're going to need a lot of money. We're going to need about, $700 billion to $1 trillion, right? How much FDI have we been able to attract every year? Let's do the math. If we attract $100 per capita per year, what's the population of Indonesia? 280 million? What's 280 million times $100? $28 billion. $28 billion. If we want to be a modern nation, we're going to need $700 billion to $1 trillion. How long will it take us to be modern? How much money? I just mentioned. So, it's near impossible unless and until we fix the rule of law. Right? And why is it an easy task if we fix the rule of law? You know how much liquidity is floating around the world right now? More than $100 trillion. You guys are familiar with BlackRock? You know how much money they manage? About $11 trillion. You're familiar with the transnational investment firms? There's about 17 of them. They manage about 60 to 70% of the global liquidity. Can you imagine? 17 companies manage about $60 trillion worth of liquidity. So your job to get this energy transition going is to know the narrative of Indonesia and to have the conviction that we have a proper rule of law and you know how to knock on the doors of the BlackRocks, the Blackstones of the world. And you convince them of our storyline. They'll put the money there if they're convinced. If they're not going. Right? So the first and the second questions smell like a rule of law kind of question. Right? The third question is with regards to intellectual bias. Well, I mean, I've talked about TikTok. There's bias and there's noise. Right? These are the two elements that basically skew our way of thinking, way of reading, way of interpreting from the facts. Right? Until such time that you get rid of the noise and the bias, we're all exposed. But how do you minimize or mitigate the risks of some sort of an intellectual bias or an intellectual noise? Well, you shape up on your literary wisdom. I would only encourage you to read books. I gave you the solution. There's 140 million books. Get every adult in Indonesia to read one book and put it all on one YouTube channel. You call it whatever podcast you want. And get every adult in Indonesia to read each one of the 140 million books. I assure you, you will have a lot less intellectual bias. You will have a lot less noise. Now, the Balfour Declaration, which was signed in 1922, shortly after the end of the World War I, was designed to, in my view, to shift a European problem to a non-European problem. Right? And we're basically seeing the manifestation of that in front of our eyes today, right? I'm not going to go into the details of this because this could get pretty sensitive. But I think what's far more important, and I said this in a morning lecture, is really more about winning the peace as opposed to winning the war, right? And I think the Global South, which is really us and a few others, we've gotten very good at embracing multipolarity. We've gotten very good in staying peaceful and stable. We've gotten very good in accepting defeat, but winning the peace. The counter to that is the Vietnam War, which was actually lost by the Americans. But the Americans, despite having lost the war, they actually won the peace. I made the assertion this morning that Vietnam today is the most ardent supporter of the United States in many dimensions, in trade, in economic, in military, whatever. They would always raise their hands in support of the US, despite the fact that the United States lost the war, but they won the peace. So in situations that we're seeing and witnessing in Eastern Europe and West Asia, you go size up as to who is likely to be the one that's going to win the peace as opposed to winning the war. I forget who the last question was.
Risk of failure, yeah, I think. Sort of, how, you're the last one, right? How from Edinburgh asked about, no, that's intellectual
No, there was
bias.
another
You've been
guy.
answered.
The tall guy. Yes. Yeah.
AI.
Yeah. No.
Living
I
side by
just wanted to spot the face. You know, I remember. I talked about AI this morning. AI is basically hallucination. Okay? It's a hallucination that's affected by hypnosis. Right? As you use ChatGPT or OpenAI, you keep infusing inputs. Those inputs are actually hypnosis into a hallucination process that keeps evolving based on a hypnosis. My observation about AI is that it is being pushed too much with technological hubris, less with other disciplines. Okay? And I made the point that AI will only entail something that's benign and judicious for all of us or all of humanity when it's being pushed forth in a multidisciplinary manner. As of now, and I'm spending time at Stanford right now, so I'm spending a lot of time with people in Silicon Valley, my observation is that there's too much technological hubris. There's less involvement with people of expertise from culture, morality, philosophy, spirituality, economics, environment, and all that good stuff. So there is a real risk here of not having a benign consequence. We may have unintended consequences that may not be good for humanity, right? Now, the other part of the question was with regards to the regulatory framework. There are tendencies within a number of countries around the world who would just want to open the kimono. Okay? I think they're taking a highly liberal approach with regards to regulating AI. And that, I think, is risky. One country that's not as liberal as many others, again, I'll say, Singapore. They've looked at this very meticulously. They're very careful about promulgating new regulations about AI before they have the confidence that this would have been actually approached in a much more multidisciplinary manner. I had lunch with the head of AI for Singapore. He's a Stanford graduate. He came to Stanford a few months ago. And we were talking about this. And I can assure you, the way Singapore is looking at it is highly different from the way other countries, which I'm not going to mention. So I would caution you about two things. Number one, until such time that you're sure that this is being approached in a multidisciplinary manner, this would have risk. The second, until such time that you are sure that the regulators have a clear understanding what this is all about, and they're taking this to a place where this is going to be approached in a much more multidisciplinary manner, I think we're all exposed. And we've seen illustrations of how this thing has turned the wrong way, how OpenAI has gone from open source to closed source, has gone from non-for-profit, not-for-profit to for-profit. How do you ensure that this hallucination is going to end up judiciously for humanity when it's actually being evaluated on a quarterly basis based on its profitability? So you need to strike the right balance between humanity and profitability. But to the extent that you tilt it more towards profitability, humanity is expensed. So that would be my take.
Yeah, Singapore is a very peculiar microcosm. It's a very, I mean, one of the worst thing, not worst, one of the most unique thing about Singapore is the way it treats diversity. It's peculiar to me. They see coercion as a precondition for freedom, which is kind of not very Western-like. For example, in public housing in Singapore, you have to maintain equal percentage for all race groups in order to then enforce freedom, but then you coerce in the beginning, which is very peculiar. But speaking of Singapore, I think it's something beyond punitive policies that make people more trustworthy in Singapore. I think there's also an element of examples from the highest in the office of political leaders. We have this phrase in Indonesia, asal bapak senang. So whatever makes my Lord happy, like a better translation. So if our Lord is trustworthy, is accountable, it's full of integrity, I think the rest will follow. I think we need a leader that sets an example. I think that's one of the key ingredients that I find it hard to come out through the current political system because there's no incentive for people. All I see in the political discussion is pragmatism and just a narrow-minded, short-sighted politics. All right, we have time for 3 more questions, and that's the last. Okay.
I've got a question about the formation of moral life. So you talk about serendipity, which entails lots of practice. And as our Inglorious Past, you mentioned House of Wisdom, they follow a particular tradition, which is Aristotelian traditions. I think you spoke about, eudaimonia, about happiness, which is essentially cultivating virtues. So perhaps you mentioned that Singaporean has these 3 virtues: competence, integrity, and accountability. But perhaps in Indonesia, so Professor Bagus mentioned that we lost a lot of historical archive. But perhaps what remains is that of visible Indonesian virtues which we can access through the language of beauty, like art, music, story, or fashion. So, framing that abstract into more like consulting, problem solving, like how can we create a long-term systematic strategic plan, let's say, for nurturing and developing Indonesian virtues with the context of long-term view, with our demography, youth, and democracy in the future, in the context of balanced power and competence. So my hypothesis is that you mentioned that Singaporean, like whenever they create, they learn from the others. So perhaps we can learn from the growth of engine of K-pop. We have like this finding talent, training, producing, and marketing. And I think briefly, I spoke with you earlier that, you have invested with, like the theme of Parasite movies. So following that, so how can we have this sort of Nusantara culture, so strategic plan, but more in more creative field?
Okay.
Thank you.
Got it.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Mas Adilan.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, Bang Gita Wirjawan and Pak Bagus. I'm Adilan from University of Nottingham. So I have a question related to your idea about the tutoring or bimbel. It's very interesting for me because I'm also a lecturer in ITB, basically mathematics or natural sciences. So this is like a long debate in my college, in the professor in mathematics, about the importance of bimbel or the importance of how we train students about the concept. Usually the bimbel focus on the practical aspect to answer some question and so on, but it lack of the conceptual understanding. However, on the other hand, if we are more focused to the conceptual understanding, like a basic math or basic physics, it takes a very long time for the students to learn. So I also know that in South Korea, the student take a lot of bimbel and then it's very successful. South Korea become very advanced, and then the PISA is very high. However, on the other hand, Finland that become more conceptual also success in the visa, but they have very different approach. That's my question is, what do you think the best approach for Indonesia to optimize our PISA score or our understanding in the basic concept and then in the basic science and so on? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Cordelia from Central St. Martin's. Now I'm pursuing the material features of design field. And I was just like wondering, because I found so many people so many Indonesian people that I found amazing with their way of thinking and the complexities that they can generate so many ideas that I found, like they rate so many literatures and everything, but actually like so little of them can execute something so well, like simple things, simple tasks. I don't know, I was just like wondering why we have this kind of lack of we have so many people that can think forward that is like very fastly or something like that, but so little like that I can claim as successful in executions in Indonesia. Thank you.
Let me confess. I may appear like I can think conceptually. I have not executed certain things well, right? The ones that I have executed well had actually involved collaborators who could fill in the gap, right? And I confess that I've had quite a number of business failures, right? And I can assure you, each one of the business failures that I went through would have been by way of making the wrong choice in terms of partnership, right? I chose the wrong partner. I chose the wrong executor. And to peel it a little more deeply, the commonality amongst all was that these were the people that I would never trust under any circumstances, right? But I've learned my lessons, right? Doesn't mean I haven't done good things. I've done quite a number of good things. But the common denominator with respect to those where I failed quite miserably, business-wise, would have been the wrong choice of partners, the wrong choice of collaborators. So going back to your situation, why is it that so many people seemingly in Indonesia have great conceptual ideas about what to do, but they just can't be married with people that have great execution wherewithal? You know, we're not going to be able to find people with great execution wherewithal if we don't fix our educational system. if we don't pursue the educational attainment with the kind of rigor that we're seeing in Korea, that we're seeing in Singapore. Let me just emphasize, Singapore has made it a point to recruit teachers from the top 20%. Korea takes it to the next level. Korea selects teachers from the top 5%. And they've taken it even to a higher level where if you would have been recruited as a teacher, you would be paid as well as if you would have gotten recruited by Amazon, Google, McKinsey, or Goldman Sachs. And they even take it to a different level where the social status, if you go back to the village, if you tell your parents, you tell your villagers that you've been recruited as a teacher, you're the coolest dude in town. So imagine that, right? If you take Indonesia to a point where you're actually recruiting from the top 5% and you make sure that these teachers are going to be as well paid as if you were to teach at Nottingham or work at Google, Amazon, Goldman, or McKinsey, then they attain this massively noble status socially that they get so much respected by the people. I think that would have manifested the kind of rigor that's required for the execution for whatever conceptual ideas that Indonesia is going to be able to come up going forward. But that takes time, and this takes to the second question. Bimbel is just a way in. It's not the way out, right? Unfortunately, if you want to get into MIT, you got to win the gold, the silver, or the bronze in Olympics in science. You can have a GPA 4.0 from any high school in Indonesia, you're not going to get into MIT until and unless you win any of those medals, right? You can have a GPA 1.9, but if you win the gold in biology, you'll get in. You'll get full funding from MIT. So how do you teach somebody to win the gold, the silver, or the bronze in the Olympics? You can acquire that skill through Bimbel. There is a high school in Seoul, one high school in Seoul. Each one of the graduates of that high school scores perfectly on SAT. Perfectly. That's 1,600. Imagine how tough that is, okay? For you to get considered at an Ivy League university, you got to score at least 1,550. Anybody here taken the SAT? You have, right? Okay, I see a lot of head shakes. Okay, I'm in the wrong country. But just to give you a sense, the SAT measures scholastic, supposedly aptitude, right, of high school graduates. But it's not an aptitude test. It's actually an acquired skills test. You can acquire those skills by way of sitting in a room rigorously for 4 months. I guarantee you're going to be able to score well. That's how they say it in Louisiana. You sit in a room for 4 months, learn how to score well on MCAT, that's when you go to the medical school. LSAT, that's when you go to the law school. GRE, when you go to the engineering school. GMAT, when you go to the business school. There are ways for you to score superlatively if you rigorously pursue this academic pursuit. 4 months. Repeatedly just taking the sample exams and then following on the advocacy given by the teacher. So if we take that route, you get into the Caltechs of the world, you get into the Nottinghams of the world, you get into the Imperials of the world, you get into the MITs and Princetons, Harvards, and Oxbridge of the world. Then, once you get in, you develop the conceptual thinking process, right? So, I think Korea has figured out the short approach earlier on, but they've figured out the long approach. And this takes you to the first question. How do we project culture? How do we project soft power? I was coincidentally, my wife and I were just in Korea a couple of weeks ago. I had to give a speech there. And I was listening into one of the speakers who talked about how South Korea has been able to project its soft power to the rest of the world by way of its K-pop, K-drama, K-movies, right? And he basically talked about the history of how they started, right? They started out basically in 1995 by way of two corporations that decided to invest in culturalists, actors, actresses, singers, whatever. They fumbled many times, but then they were basically supported by a number of episodic triumphs. The first one of which would have been the hardware disruption. That's when Samsung and LG were able to create handphones that became handy and became the tools for communicating in a much more efficient and effective manner. Then the internet, was able to be basically traversing through these devices made by LG and Samsung. Then the third would have been the digital disruptions by way of the social media. Facebook, Google, YouTube, you name it, right? These were platforms that were able to basically help disseminate whatever content that was created, whether it's somebody dancing, somebody singing, somebody crying, somebody whatever. And a fourth, I guess I'm boring her. The fourth would have been the democratization of South Korea in a very robust manner. South Korea has become a democracy that was able to democratize information, ideas, capital, and all that good stuff. The fifth was basically the coordination between government and the private sector. So think about this. Without 5 of these attributes, you would not be watching drakor the way you are. You would not be listening to BTS or what's the pink thing? Blackpink that went to the Buckingham Palace, right? You wouldn't be, watching. But this is not a downer on Korea, but think about this. There is a structural limitation. The structural limitation with Korea is its homogeneity. It lacks heterogeneity. Okay? So culturally, they're actually structurally stymied by their own homogeneity. They lack diversity. This is what really cool. We are really cool. We got so much diversity, but we lack rigor. We lack the Korean rigor. We're in no way, in a position to basically create the necessary hardware disruption the way LG and Samsung did. We're in no way in a situation to basically create the digital disruptions the way the Americans did. I'm not going to talk about democracy. I'm not going to talk about the coordination between government and private sector. So we've got diversity. We've got a lot of cultural capability. But we got a number of things that are still needing a bit of fixing. Until then, I think, we should be content with not being able to overcome the Korean soft power projection. I would predict the next soft power projector in a big way is India, right? I mean, people are already watching Bollywood, like you wouldn't believe. Pretty soon you'll be dancing like the Bollywood dancers, right? And mark my word, in Southeast Asia, it's going to be the Singaporeans. Because they're probably smelling and sniffing. If the Koreans did it with lack of diversity, we should be able to do it. We have a little bit more diversity. We've got the Indian culture, we've got the Chinese culture, we've got the Malay culture, we've got the Eurasian culture. Let's mix it all up and project it. On top of it all, we got the money. Singapore has the money. We don't have the money. No fulus, right? And let me end with, a touch on what Bagus alluded to. Singapore kind of coerced racial integration. They were not worried about the short term. They were more worried about the long-term unintended consequences. If they would have democratized the way the Indians, the Malays, and the Chinese would have been living and schooling, they would have been segregated. And Lee Kuan Yew was resolute about this. He did not want the unintended long-term consequences, as a result of which he forced them into one building. You live with each other. He forced them into one place of eating. You eat with each other. He forced them into one school. You go to school with each other. So you understand the pluses and minuses of each other. You learn to live. But I'll make sure that you're educated, and I'll make sure that you're well-fed. I'll make sure that you're intellectually gifted, and I'll make sure that you're morally equipped, socially equipped. And the long-term unintended consequences were avoided, right? That's his thinking, I think. And there's a saying, right? You know what a Leviathan is? Yes. Right? So you want to make sure that we are a shackled Leviathan, right? This was basically written by a guy by the name of James Robinson, the guy that wrote Why Nations Fail, remember? I interviewed him for one of my podcast episodes. In one of his later books, he basically wrote about the need for any nation to be a cool nation. That nation needs to be a shackled Leviathan. It cannot be a silent Leviathan. It cannot be a despotic Leviathan. A shackled Leviathan, basically a Leviathan that manifests balance between who's ruling and civil society. And how do you create the right balance between civil society and who rules? Who? What? Rule of law. Without rule of law, you're not going to find the right balance between leadership and civil society. So if we're not going to be a shackled Leviathan, we're still exposed. So our goal as a nation is to be a shackled Leviathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So just a little for my British students. So I think one of the first who coined the terms Leviathan is the guy by the name of Thomas Hobbes in the 1600s. And I think it was in the backdrop of English Civil War when he wrote that. And I think if we have enough time, I would like to talk more about that with you. But I would like to close with this, Gita. The most important step towards recovery or remedy is diagnose.
Yeah.
With the right diagnosis, that would be the first, even more so than the medicine. That's what you've done today. So it's a diagnosis of where we are, what our ailments are, and I think hopefully we can take it forward towards finding the solution. So with that, I would like to thank you for your continuous support and friendship, and to the University of Nottingham as well, and for the very fruitful event today.
Inilah Endgame. Southeast Asians and most members of the Global South are used to multipolarity. We've learned to basically embrace whatever externality, whoever externality that's come upon us, and still entail peace and stability.